Chapter 2. Going to the Fair, in which Max finds a mystery and Peter comes into possession of a family heirloom. Long ago, in the land of Hesse, far from the fields that we know, a grey-spotted mule named Bonnie Lumpen pulled a fat and rickety caravan wagon down a dusty road. No one sat upon the caravan's front bench to steer her. In fact, no reins connected her to any driver, present or absent, because she was one of those talking sort of animals who could simply be told where to go. And besides, she travelled this route many times before, once every year in fact, and she knew the way. Bonnie Lumpen plodded along at her accustomed sedate pace, pulling the caravan behind her, which swayed precariously, first one way and then the other, in the road's deep ruts, always threatening to turn over, but never quite making up its mind to do so. The caravan belonged to the Piper family, who, as their name implied, were travelling musicians. Just as Miller's Mill and Fletcher's Fletch, the Pipers piped. At least 3 out of the 4 did. The father, Johannes, and his 2 sons, Max the eldest, and young Peter, all played the long pipe, which was sometimes called the single pipe, or occasionally even the flute, as it was still known back then, before some enterprising soul came along later and decided all true flutes should be turned sideways to play. Mother Piper, though, never had a knack for playing any sort of wind instrument, but instead found herself gifted at playing just about everything else. While Johannes, Max, and Peter would weave intricate melodies with their 3 flutes, madly sweeping and swooping in and out of one daring harmony after another, Mother, whose name was Beatrice, thank you for asking, would accompany them on a skin drum for one song, or strum along on a lute for another, and then deftly switch to a lovely and resonant wooden xylophone, the pride of all her personal possessions, for yet a third. Or she'd ring bells, or crash cymbals, and generally find some way to coax music out of anything that could be struck, strummed, picked, thumped, whacked, or plucked. The family had no home except for their wagon. They lived the life of happy vagabonds, travelling here and there throughout the year, going to festivals and fairs and every other sort of scheduled celebration, where they'd make their living by letting anyone call the tune, provided they were willing to pay the pipers. On this particular day, when the autumn leaves were just beginning to flirt with a change of dress, they were on their way to their favourite venue of the year, the Harvest Festival, which would take place in Old Winson Town just 2 days hence. It wasn't the quality of the celebration that attracted them, though it was certainly one of the nicer ones, nor was it any aspect of the town itself, which seemed in every measurable way a pleasant town indeed. No, it was the stop along the road that they would make later this afternoon, provided Bonnie Lumpen could keep up a pace and no unforeseen hazards blocked their path. Every year, on their way to the fair, the Pipers would stop the night before at the country estates of Squire Radolph Peep, a gentleman farmer of local renown, husband to Crescentia and father to Ariane, Agathe, Bridget, Dorothy, Alfred, and Esmeralda, or as young Peter once called them on a previous visit, an entire flock of daughters. On their annual visits, Squire Peep, who was a generous soul by nature and never more so than to his dear friends, would host the Pipers, welcoming them into his home and treating them to as lavish a banquet as he could supply and anyone could ever hope to receive. Then, after the dishes were cleared away, and the various frosted, berried, and custard-filled desserts were merely a happy memory, the Peeps and their 17 house servants, along with an ever-changing number of farmhands, shepherds, swineherds, cowherds, brewmasters, stable-masters, stable-boys, carpenters, wheelwrights, and sundry other hired workers, would crowd into the mansion's great room for a night of entertainment, which they anticipated year-around. Someone would stoke a crackling fire in the huge stone fireplace. Someone else would bring in pitchers of mulled wine and giant steins of frosty beer. And because of the special occasion, even the younger children would get to try a sip or two. There'd be laughter and small talk, followed by intermittent cries of shh and settle down, until gradually an eager, anticipatory hush would enfold the room, taking hold in fits and starts over the entire hall, as one by one they'd realize the pipers had started to play. The first notes always came low and stealthy, a murmured promise, a light tickling of the ears. But slowly the melodies grew and retreated, and then grew again, back and forth, sometimes like a lover's tease, and sometimes like the unstoppable tide, until finally the music swelled into a grand and glorious thing, taking absolute control over the room and everyone in it. It was always in the Pepys' great hall once every autumn, playing not for money, but only for the entertainment of sweet friends, that the pipers gave their best concert of the year. Then, the next morning, they'd pack up their caravan again for the last day's journey into old Winson town. And the Pepys, too, would load their many wagons with harvest goods and ride behind their friends to the festival, where the pipers would find a bandstand to play, and the Pepys would find their stall in the farmer's market. Along the way, Johannes and Radolf would usually walk together, some distance out ahead of the slow-moving wagon train. They'd fiddle with their pipes, the kind for smoking, not playing, and exchange tobaccos. They'd talk about which giant pumpkin Agatha Peep had selected this year to enter into the judging, and which little lamb young Esmeralda believed had the best chance of winning the grand palm. Or they'd talk about how Father Johannes had 2 sons, while Father Radolf had too many daughters, and maybe it isn't entirely too early to start thinking about the future. Every year, the particulars of their conversation would change, but unknown to either man, the subject was ever the same: how they were good and true friends, and would always remain so. Now on the country road, bordered on both sides by the dusky trees of the Schwarzwald, the endless Transylvanian Black Forest that blanketed the entire continent of the Hesse, Peter Piper lay silent but awake in his bunk in the back of the caravan, and thought about what the coming night might portend. His parents were dozing in their great bed, which took up the entire front of the compartment. His father's quiet snoring was rhythmic and comforting, like a metronome. Max wasn't in the caravan's cabin, which was crowded with everything they owned in all the world, but that wasn't unusual these days. He'd grown oddly sullen and ever more insistent on privacy of late. His father told him this was because Max was 14 now, on the threshold of becoming a man, and it was a time in life when every young man begins to ponder his place in the world. Max was no doubt sleeping outside, up on top, sprawled across the baggage tied up there, or maybe stretched out in the front of the wagon on the driver's bench. It was their family custom in the cool of the afternoon to take a nap so that they could stay awake longer into the night. A musician's day typically begins when the work days of all others have ended. Peter shifted and squirmed in his bed and couldn't sleep, partly because he'd outgrown the small bunk. He'd turned 10 this year and had experienced a surprising spurt of growth. Now he could no longer quite fit into the cozy little space tucked under the polished legs of Mother's xylophone, where he'd always fit so snugly in years past. This was becoming a problem, but it wasn't the real reason sleep eluded him. He was thinking about the amazing dinner to come, and the treats and the gifts that would follow. He thought about the large and roly-poly Mr. P, who turned bright colors when he laughed, which was often, and who always treated him kindly, even though the squire was an important man of wealth, while Peter was merely the penniless son of a travelling minstrel. He thought about the gigantic estate where they would spend the night in lavishly appointed guest rooms, one of which, astonishingly, Peter would get all to himself. And besides the main house, there were all of the other buildings and the endless expanse of land, full of dogs and animals and other people. People who never changed from one day to the next and one town to the next, and a home that never moved but stayed in one place all of the time. Always there, always reliable, always home. But most of all, Peter thought about the youngest Peep daughter. She was 8 or maybe 9 years old by now, practically of an age with him. She'd been christened Esmeralda at birth, but no one ever called her that, because from the first day Mr. Peep had lovingly dubbed her Father's Little Rainbow, which had caught on with Mother Peep and the 5 older sisters and the informal extended family of hired hands. Later, they'd shortened it to the more manageable Rainbow, and later again, just to Bo. So though Esmeralda might have been a given name, Bo Peep was her real name, earned through the only true tests of such things, time and repetition. Peter couldn't sleep because he thought about Bo, and also he thought about how odd it was to be thinking about her. She'd been his once-a-year playmate for as many years as he could remember. They'd scaled imaginary castle walls together and vanquished fierce dragons. They'd made mud pies and mud forts and just about anything else that could be formed out of mud. No matter how often the games changed, they'd always played together because they were friends, and that was that. But then, last year, something happened that changed everything. On the final day of the Harvest Festival in Old Winson Town, when both families were loading up their wagons and saying their reluctant goodbyes, the Peeps to return home and the Pipers to move on, Bo had done a strange and alarming thing. She'd taken Peter around behind the wagons, where they were all alone, and solemnly kissed him on his cheek, saying, "We can marry when we grow up." Peter was appalled. He vigorously and savagely wiped her kiss off his cheek right in front of her, which brought instant tears to her eyes. She turned and ran from his sight with an angry huff of breath, which quickly turned into a great wet honk of despair, as only a thoroughly miserable, blubbering, runny-nosed child can make. That was the last he'd seen of her. Over the intervening year, he'd often remembered that small, chaste kiss and wondered what it meant. And he wondered if they could become friends again this time, or if she'd somehow grown into too much of a girl, like her sisters, so that their children's adventure games were done forever. He was 10 now. If not close to being a man yet, he was not nearly a child any longer. Maybe it was time for him to put away silly children's games as well. But then, what would they do instead? If you had a friend and wanted to spend as much time with her as possible in the very little time you had, what else could you do but go out and play? Once in a while, he'd seen how some of Bo's older sisters spent time with the boys who'd call on them. They wouldn't do anything but sit on the front porch and talk all day, or stroll together through the gardens and talk some more. How many things could there possibly be to talk about? And why would anyone want to waste his time doing that, when instead he could be doing something fun? Peter had seen those boys who came to visit the Peep daughters, and every one of them looked nervous and fidgety, sometimes completely miserable, and always as though they'd prefer to be anywhere else but where they were, talking and talking endlessly throughout the day. Lord of the murky depths! What if that's all Bo wanted to do from now on? Sometime in the last year, while he wasn't even looking, his entire world had transformed into something alien and impossible to understand, and somehow it was all Bo Peep's fault. This is what he thought about as Forrest gradually gave way to fields, and a turn in the road brought the caravan wagon into view of the Peep estates. "Time to wake up," Bonnie Lumpen called from outside. "We're here." "Welcome!" Squire Peep bellowed from the shade of his columned veranda. "Welcome back to our home." He'd been sitting in a high-backed cane chair as they drove up, and needed the help of his walking stick in one hand and a solid tug from one of his daughters on the other hand. It was Dorothy, or possibly Bridget, to rise to his feet. "We couldn't get a single thing done today because we were all too excited waiting for you." In the time it took Mr. Peep to negotiate the 3 steps down from the porch, the front doors burst open and Mrs. Peep flew by him and rushed into the yard, making happy squealing sounds all the while. There followed a long bout of hugging and backslapping as Mother Piper hugged Mother Peep, and then Mr. Piper hugged Mrs. Peep, while Mr. Peep hugged Mrs. Piper. The men happily whacked at each other, as men will do, and then the daughters, more of whom had materialized seemingly out of thin air, joined into the thick of it, and the greetings went on and on. Only 5 of the 6 Peep daughters were there, which might seem like plenty, unless, like Peter, you were looking for one in particular who just happened to be the one absent. Some time passed before anyone noticed that Max was missing too. Max, it turned out, hadn't been napping up on top of the baggage or in the driver's bench. He was nowhere to be seen. This wasn't immediate cause for alarm. The caravan moved so slowly that many times one or more of the family would step down along the road to stretch his legs, walking beside the wagon, or wander off on some brief side trip, knowing he could easily catch up again. More than once, the 2 brothers, back when they still enjoyed each other's company, spied a nice pond to swim in, or a creek promising fish, and spent entire afternoons letting the caravan get far ahead, but they always managed to catch up again by dinner time. "I didn't notice when he'd left us," Bonnie Lumpen said. "Nothing's amiss. He'll turn up soon enough," Johannes said, though Beatrice couldn't help but show a mother's worry. Her worry was misplaced, though, because in little time at all, Max came trotting down the dirt road, excitedly waving his hand, where he carried something the others couldn't see at this distance. Max was tall and lanky, and so skinny that concerned farmwives and townwives all along their travels constantly tried to feed him back into good health. Max didn't much mind the attention, possibly because it was his alone and something he didn't have to share with his little brother, who was also slim but not alarmingly so, and he didn't mind the food. Max could eat like a horse after having eaten a horse. But no matter how much he put away, he never added an inch of girth. He had a mop of tangled hair on his head, which was brown like all of the Pipers, but a lighter shade than Peter's very dark brown hair. Max was barefoot. He wore bright red pants and a yellow shirt of good linen. Over that, he wore a forest green tunic that was elaborately decorated with gold stitching. These were his performance clothes, which he liked to wear at all times, unlike Peter, who couldn't wait to get out of his gaudy show dress once a night's playing was done. "I like bright colors," was all that Max said one day when Peter had asked him about it. This annoyed Johannes and Beatrice no end, arguing as they often did that his good clothes, which were terribly expensive, would last much longer if he didn't wear them so often. But Max was impervious to their logic. He'd always select his performance clothes to wear, unless and until specifically ordered out of them. And then he'd put them on again, as soon as he determined the term covered by that order had probably expired. By contrast, Peter preferred simple brown homespun, which is what he was wearing today. Max dashed between the twin stone gateway pillars that marked the entrance to Peep Lands and ran up the dirt driveway, bordered by twin rows of juniper trees. He was still carrying whatever it was he so earnestly wanted the others to see. "Look what I found!" he shouted as he ran. "Stuck in a tree! I saw it from a wagon!" When he reached the others, quite out of breath by that time, he held out his discovery for all to examine. It was an arrowhead made out of iron or steel and still attached to a few inches of broken-off yew-wood shaft. The arrowhead was dark, almost black, and wickedly barbed. The bit of wood extending from it was painted dark red. Alternating bands of black and ochre thread attached the barbed head to the rest of it. "It was stuck in a tree, but I still saw it," Max said again when some of his wind had returned. "Have you ever seen anything like it before?" "Actually, no," Radolf Pepys said, taking it from Max and examining it more closely. "Its markings aren't familiar to me. Not the signature of any huntsman I know around here. It almost looks foreign. Where did you find it?" "About 2 miles up the road," Max said. That's on my land, sure enough," Radolf said. "I don't mind a fellow taking a deer when he needs to, but the proper course is to ask first." "What if it wasn't a hunter?" Max said. "What if this is from an advance scout for an invading army?" "Well, I imagine that's the sort of thing that someone would notice," Radolf said. "Neighbors would certainly spread the word about armies tramping around in our woods." "But I have heard about it," Max said. "Lots of times." "I'm afraid my son has fallen in love with some wild stories he picked up in other towns," Johannes interrupted. "There are always rumors about terrible invading hordes. It's standard tavern talk by bored men who want to imagine their lives are more exciting than they are. But of course, the fanciful armies have always invaded that distant town no one trades with, or that far-away kingdom that nobody ever visits. It's never any place someone actually knows. Finding a bit of arrow stuck in a tree is just the sort of thing to reignite his imagination." "It's perfectly understandable," Radolf laughed. "Why, in my childhood, I can't begin to count the number of times I had to single-handedly repel foreign barbarians from those very same woods. Perhaps we should all get inside, where we'll be safe." He laughed again, and others joined in. Then he turned to Peter and said more soberly, "I suspect you're wondering where my youngest has gotten herself off to. Well, she can't seem to pull herself away from her lambs these days, not even long enough to show basic courtesy to honored guests. She's got it into her head that every blessed one of them is this year's top prize winner. Why don't you go out behind the house and see if you can find her?" "And save her from Max's pillaging hordes," Elfrid said, which inspired more laughter. Peter ran off around the house, and everyone else began to move inside, including Max, who turned quiet and sullen again. He trailed behind the rest of them, hanging his head and beginning to sulk at the fun that was made of him. But when he tried to enter the house behind the rest, Johannes paused in the doorway, blocking it. "Not you, Max," he said. "Not before you unhitch Bonnie Lumpen from the wagon and give her a good brushing." "Why?" Max whined. "They have servants here to do that." "They aren't our servants," Johannes said. "Why am I being singled out? I didn't do anything wrong." "This isn't punishment, boy. It's duty. You're becoming a man now, and a man learns to get his work done before he rests and plays." "But Peter got off to run and play." "Peter's only 10 years old. When you were still 10, I didn't make you do such chores either. I did them." But now, in my rapidly approaching dotage, I'm reminded of a rhyme someone once taught me. The name of my son is my works done. More and more each day, that's going to have to be you, Max. Think on it. And think about this too while you do your honest labor. Peter's the most gifted player of the three of us. Whether he works harder at it than we do, or it comes natural to him, I can't say. He can simply do things with a flute that you or I can't match, which means he brings in more money than either of us. So consider that when you're tempted again to worry about who is or isn't pulling his full weight around here. So Max unhitched Bonnie Lumpen and walked with her to the stables, where she amiably chatted with the other animals, those who could talk, while he brushed her down. Reluctant though he was, he did a good and thorough job of it, because the mule could tell on him if he didn't. As he worked, he stewed about the arrowhead he'd found. I did hear about real invaders, he thought. Not just rumors, because too many of the stories matched. They got lots of details the same. They should have listened to me. And they probably should have listened, although it's doubtful, had anyone believed him, that they could have done anything different to stave off or even mitigate the many sorrows to come. Little Bo Peep was standing in the greenest field of grass Peter had ever seen. It was a small, natural meadow set between a stand of hickory trees on one side and one curving edge of the big peach orchard on the other. 7 little white lambs and one scrawny black one grazed on the grass, keeping it cropped down so close to the earth that it looked no thicker than his father's whiskers an hour after he'd just shaved. Bo was in the yard, facing away from him, while imperiously ordering a single harried but enthusiastic sheepdog about, commanding that he not let any one of their charges break ranks and wander out of the meadow or too far from the others. The dog responded with enough "Yes, missus," and "No, missus," and "Right away, missus," that it all strung together as one long run-on sentence. "Bo," Peter said when he'd approached close enough behind her to be heard. She turned around and regarded him without expression. He knew right away it was a practiced gesture. She'd rehearsed this moment, planning well in advance exactly where she'd be when he first saw her and exactly what she'd been doing. He was surprised, realizing that it was an adult thing to do, something that should have been beyond her few years. He could never imagine arranging such a scene himself. She was a little girl on stage, starring in a play that he was also part of, except that he'd forgotten to learn his lines. Not knowing what he was expected to say next, he said nothing. "Welcome back, Peter," she finally said, in a way that made him feel anything but welcome. "We've missed you. I'm so sorry I wasn't there to greet you right away when you'd arrived, but I've been ever so busy with my lambs. See how pretty they are?" Peter started to say that he did, but she spoke quickly to cut him off. It seemed there was more to his speech. "All except the black one, of course. He's sickly and doesn't eat well. He's also stubborn and doesn't know how to mind like the others. I don't know why I keep him. One shouldn't become fond of stupid and stubborn things." Peter knew exactly what was coming next. "I named him Peter," she announced. "Of course. After you," she added. She didn't need to. He'd fully understood her intent. Some of this play was still being written by an uncertain little girl. "I'm positive I'll win all of the prizes this year with my lambs, don't you think? I won't enter Peter the lamb, though. He couldn't win anything and would make me look bad just for having him. He'll have to stay here when we go to the fair, where he'll likely be chopped up for our dinner some night." This year, for the first time that he could recall, Bo wasn't dressed in the rough and tumble, good-to-get-dirty-in sort of clothes that she'd always favored in the past. Now she wore a pale green and tan summer dress, which should have been put away by this time of the year, but she'd probably insisted on it, and the days were still warm enough. Her long blonde hair, a bit lighter than that of her 5 golden-haired sisters, was tied behind her with a pretty blue ribbon. She held her own miniature shepherd's crook made just to her size. All in all, she looked very much like a pretty little girl, and not much at all like the Bo he'd known in the past. When enough time passed that Peter was sure she'd finished everything she'd memorized to say, he said, "I'm sorry I made you cry." "What do you mean, Peter?" she said. "Made me cry? When?" "Last year, at the end of the fair. You kissed me and I wiped it off, and you cried." "I never did. You just don't remember right." "You did, and I felt bad all year," he said. "No, no, no," she said, angrily tapping the end of a crook in front of her, like a blind man tapping his cane. Little tufts of grass were torn out with every stab. "I didn't cry because of anything you did. I think a bee stung me that year, and it hurt. That's all." "I'm still sorry, and I'd like to be friends again. And that's all I had to say." Peter turned to walk back to the house, a little hurt and a little confused, because it looked like this had indeed become one of those talking-only kinds of friendships, if they were still going to be friends at all. Bo had truly turned into one of her sisters. But after a few steps, Peter paused and faced her again. "I like the little black sheep, and I hope you never chop him up for dinner. And if you ever kiss me again, I promise not to wipe it off this time." He went inside then, leaving her out in the meadow with her sheep. That night after dinner, the pipers played again, as they did each year, but this time everyone agreed that they'd outdone themselves. Their music touched on things that were impossible to describe and seemed entirely outside the province of what mankind should ever hope to grasp, much less attempt. When the concert ended, and the last dregs of wine and beer had been swallowed, or mopped up, or poured out, and everyone had been properly wished a good night with pleasant dreams, Johannes asked Peter to tarry behind. The others were already heading up to their rooms, with candles in one hand and bed warmers in the other, the covered pans newly filled with fresh hot embers from the dying fire. "Walk outside with me for a minute," he said, "and let's look at the stars before turning in." They did. "No stars tonight, Father," Peter said. "Just clouds covering the entire sky." "That's all right," Johannes said. "I didn't really want to gaze at stars. I wanted to talk to you alone about something important." Johannes had carried his flute out there with him, as he always did. While all of their instruments were valuable enough, Mother's precious xylophone being a good example, Father's flute was a pearl beyond price. It was the single most important treasure the family owned. They never left it packed away in the caravan with the other things, where someone could come along and steal it. Father kept it with him always. Usually, when he wasn't actually playing it, he'd immediately put it away in its protective sheath of hard-boiled leather, lined with soft satin, which he wore on his belt like a knight's great broadsword, or slung over his shoulder like a royal courier's dispatch pouch. Tonight, Father hadn't put it away, but carried it openly, and a little bit reverently. It wasn't very big, barely 13 inches long, which was almost piccolo-sized, though it played a full octave higher than a piccolo. It had a slightly flared cone at one end, 8 holes in between, and a whistle-style mouthpiece at the other, which was carved so flat and thin that it looked like the blade of a knife. The small flute was pearly white, having been carved from a single piece of ivory and then polished to a lustrous sheen that could reflect even the dimmest starlight, had there been any stars out to provide it. And like all truly important things, it had a name, which was Frost. Johannes held Frost out where Peter could see it. He said, "How many times have I told you Frost's story?" "I don't know," Peter said. "Lots." "Well, I'm going to tell it again, one last time. And this time, pay very special attention, because there's more to the tale that I never included before. You'll want to remember every detail, so that some night, many years from now, you can say the same things to your own son." Peter felt a sudden thrill of excitement, as if he was kneeling at a lost treasure chest that he just unburied and was about to open. He knew instinctively that he was on the cusp of something life-altering, but it was a disturbing sensation too, and even a bit frightening, like that moment just before a dreadful lie is about to be revealed. Long ago, Father said, when the world was still young, terrible frost giants ruled the far north. The worst of the lot was named Bryn the Thunderer, who'd kill and eat anyone who wandered into his domain, and would also plunder and raid down into the kingdoms of man, stealing cattle and gold, reaving and slaughtering wheresoever he went. No one could stand against Bryn, until Jorg, the legendary warrior bard, swore powerful oaths that he'd go north and write an end to Bryn's depredations for all time. Now there was magic back then in the early songs, and therefore in those who could sing them. Every great hero at the age was also a musician. Jorg travelled north and stood outside of Bryn's great tower, and he called to the giant to come out and do battle. Which the giant did, Peter said, too excited to keep from interrupting. This was part of the story he knew very well. Yes, Father said, the frost giant came out and they did fierce battle with each other. A battle that lasted 4 days and 3 nights and shook the ice-covered lands all around them. But Jorg couldn't prevail, and the giant finally repulsed him. But that night Jorg wrote a song about the great battle and sang it to the earth and the moon and the stars. And the earth and the moon and the stars listened and took note. The next day, Jorg went to stand again before Bryn's dark tower, and again called him out to battle. And this second great and thundering battle also lasted 4 days and 3 nights, before Jorg was repulsed once more. That night, Jorg wrote another song about the second battle, and the earth and the moon and the stars listened again and took note. But Jorg was as clever as he was brave and mighty. This time he added a verse to his song wherein he promised that on the 3rd time they battled, he'd win a decisive victory and overthrow the giant, taking his head and all of his treasures. And the earth and the moon and the stars pondered this and conferred together and decided that this must indeed come to pass, for it's been written in a song. Before that day, and remember that this happened during the early days of all things, nothing untrue had ever been written into a song. So Jorg and the frost giant battled a 3rd time, and it also lasted for 4 days and 3 nights. But this time, Jorg won. He overthrew Bryn and took his head and all of his treasures. Now we can never know if Jorg defeated the giant solely by his own strength, or if his song convinced the earth and the moon and the stars to help, or even if the very fact of the song was itself enough to conjure powerful magic that determine the battle's outcome. But what we do know is that Jorg the Clever cut off one of the giant's fingers to roast over a fire for his dinner that night. And the finger was bigger than the biggest suckling pig, Peter said, jumping in with another part that he knew. Yes, it made a fine meal, Johannes said. Despite the interruptions, he couldn't help but smile at his son's obvious enthusiasm. He continued, So Jorg ate the giant's finger down to the bone, and then he took Bryn's white finger bone and carved this very flute out of it, and called it Frost. He held the flute out again for his son to see, and it had great magic in it. Jorg was our distant ancestor. Diluted though it may be over the generations, the blood of heroes runs in our veins. When he grew old, Jorg gave Frost to his son Alban, who passed it on to his son Albrecht, who passed it on to his son, and so on and so forth for 100 generations or more, until I received it from my father, your grandfather. We've always owned it from almost the very beginning of time, and this is important. Frost must never be lost or allowed to be stolen or given away to anyone but those of our bloodline, or a dire curse will befall us from now on and for every generation to come. That's the bad part of the magic that's in this thing, and part of what I never told you before. Do you think you can remember that, Peter? Yes, but... That's when Peter began to suspect what was about to happen, and he realized something was very wrong. He knew the part about the generations and that Frost was handed down from father to son for more years than he could ever begin to imagine, and he knew this moment would come some day, but not so soon, and not to him. But Max, he began to say. No, Johannes said, not Max. This is for you. Max may be the oldest, so if I had any lands or high titles to pass on, those would rightly go to him. But Frost doesn't get handed off to the oldest son. It goes to the best musician. And that's you. I've known it for some time and suspected it even longer. And tonight, when you played the way you did, I realized it was past time to hand Frost over to the next piper to own it. Remember that it isn't a gift, it's a responsibility and a sacred trust, and sometimes even a burden. You can already play better than I ever could or ever will, and that was while I had Frost to play, and you only had your ordinary pipe made of ordinary wood. In the days and years to come, you'll discover notes you've never imagined before, and find new tunes to play that are so simple and perfect, you'll wonder how you never thought of them before. And there's one more thing you need to know, and this is part of the good magic that's left in the flute, even after so many ages. Because Jorg battled Bryn 3 times in that long-ago day, then 3 times and only 3 times in your entire life, you can call on Frost's powers. You can use it to play a tune that will make any danger, great or small, pass you by. Really? Really, Johannes said. 3 times only, though. Remember that part. Then that particular bit of magic won't work again until you pass it on to your son. And you did it, Father? You made danger pass you by? Yes, and I don't mind telling you that it saved me from a nasty turn or 2. But that was all in my brash youth, when I was full of pepper and aching for adventure. I don't want to scare you with the details of the first 2 occasions, But the third and final time I had need of Frost's powers was when I was courting your mother. I wasn't the only young bravo who'd caught her eye back then. My rival was the grown son of a landed baron, who liked nothing so much as taking offense at every imagined slight, shooting at folks with his arrows, stabbing folks with his spears, and chopping with his sword into pretty near any unwary skull that had the bad fortune to cross his path. And when he wasn't doing that, he was out riding on his chargers at the head of armored columns, making war on his many unhappy neighbors. "So what did you do?" Peter asked. "What could I do?" Johannes answered. "I was determined to wed your mother, and that made the baron's son awfully prickly. So I played him a sweet tune, and he went away to pick other fights. If I can offer you any advice on how to make use of your 3 gifts now that you own Frost, I'd caution you to choose wisely how you decide to spend them. Sometimes a situation turns out in retrospect to be not nearly so dire as it may have seemed at first, and only 3 turns at anything can go by surprisingly fast." Without any further words, Johannes handed Frost over to Peter, who took it in both hands and couldn't tear his eyes off it. He'd held it many times before, but it never felt quite as heavy as it did now. For a long time, no one spoke a word, until Johannes finally said, "It's grown late, and we need to make an early start of it in the morning. Time to go to bed, son." Peter had many dreams that night, and all of them involved wonderful and dangerous adventures where he had to fight valiantly against impossible odds. And Bo was in every one of them, always nearby, always waiting for him to win her from horrible barons' sons and other deadly monsters.